Hello and welcome to Placing People First, a Next Phase podcast celebrating innovations in life sciences. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Sheela Upadhyaya. Hi, Sheela.
Hi, Steve.
Hi. Thanks very much for joining us. It's great to have you on the podcast. So Sheela is, among many things, a rare diseases expert and a very trusted advisor across the public, private and charitable sectors. She delivered 12 new therapeutics into the NHS during the COVID pandemic, and she's got expertise in all aspects of accelerating therapies for rare diseases into the NHS. So our podcast at Next Phase is all about celebrating innovations in life sciences. And it's very clear that Sheela has dedicated her career to innovative thinking. So today, what I'd love to do is to understand more about your background, Sheela, and what led you in this direction, as well as discussing some of the main challenges that the sector is facing, particularly that disconnect between the manufacturers of advanced therapies and the end recipients in the clinic. So to begin with, I'd love to learn more about you. I'd love to learn more about what led you into the sector in the first place. It was your own background, from what I understand, was in computer studies. And then that's taken you on this incredible, started you to go off on this incredible career today across the NHS, across commissioning, NICE, ISPOR, and with involvement in education at almost all levels. So looking back on your career, what was it that took you in this direction, and what's helped you to continue progressing the way that you have?
It's an interesting question, Steve. And first of all, thanks for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you. So my entry into the life sciences arena began around 24 years ago. Now I'm giving away my age to all of your listeners. But I managed a large cancer service delivering against what was the National Cancer Plan. It was one of the big government initiatives at that time, accelerating treatments and care for patients in line with all those national targets. But my journey into rare diseases is a really funny one, and not one that was planned. Basically, I was looking for acceleration and progression in the NHS into a new role, something more senior and something more different. And I came across a role in the National Specialised Commissioning Team, and it was for a specialised commissioner. I'd never heard of this team before. Never done any commissioning. However, I knew I had all of the transferable skills that they were asking for in the role, and promptly applied and was successful in securing a role in that team. And in that time, I held responsibility for the genetics and metabolics portfolio. So it really kind of opened my eyes to, genetics, this is something that's happening, and this is going back about 15 odd years ago now. And it really put me in front and center in terms of understanding how some of the earlier trials were being undertaken in gene therapy. And it enabled me to expose myself to some of the innovative research in a landscape where patients had, in most cases, no options. And the conditions and the diseases in rare were really often very severely debilitating, or in a lot of situations, particularly the pediatric populations, life-limiting. This kind of role led me to learn that actually we needed to work really closely with a wide range of stakeholders at all levels, including the pharmaceutical industry and patients, to better understand the needs of those patients. And the needs around how those innovations that were coming through the horizon, because the rare disease landscape in the healthcare system was a really fertile ground for innovations. And it allowed me to work with the services, the pharmaceutical industry, and the patients to really develop what was needed to address all of these difficult challenges. I learned to better understand the system and the needs of the system stakeholders. And it enabled me to deliver more efficient and more effective services for the diseases while meeting all the needs of all these stakeholder communities. And I firmly believe there is real value in understanding that full life cycle of a process or a product development or system in a collaborative way, because I really feel that results in us being able to deliver the value where it's needed in that product cycle. My expertise in rare diseases then led me to NICE, where I was lucky enough to lead the highly specialised technology programme. And that programme was initiated when the NHS was reconfigured in 2013 to evaluate and appraise therapies for very rare diseases for entry into the NHS, because they're also very expensive and very difficult to manufacture, as I'm sure your stakeholders in your community will know. And I was able to deliver 14 new innovations into the NHS in the space of 4 years, along with novel processes to address evidence gaps. And this is where I think my real learning came, because what I learned in that environment is the industry is running a race.
Okay.
They are running a race to marketing authorization. They're running a race to be the first to market. They're running a race to secure access and return on that investment that they've put in to develop these innovative products, so they can continue to innovate. But they're also being pressurized by the rare disease patients who have no or suboptimal treatments available to them to run the race faster because they want access. And they're running, those patients are running a race against time because they don't want their diseases to further progress, or if they are life limiting, they want that situation to be changed.
Absolutely.
But in that race, some of the activities that are needed by the system are not as well done as they could be. For example, each of the processes in a drug development pathway has a hurdle to get through. So the manufacturers have to get through certain manufacturing requirements and regulatory requirements in order for them to be able to demonstrate that the product is quality assured and isn't going to have any negative effects when they are then used in humans.
Sure.
And developers are, in my estimation, only looking at the next hurdle. They don't look at the full race that they need to run. And in rare diseases, generally, the evidence base is already really poor. So there's a lack of understanding around the natural history. There's very small populations to understand how the disease is operating. It's very difficult to engage patients in trials. So you're already starting from a really difficult foundation when you're developing a drug or a gene therapy or any innovative therapy in the rare disease space. So because developers only keep the next hurdle in mind and not the whole journey, the product arrives at the desk of regulators and NICE and payers, and there's vital evidence and data missing that could have been captured if they'd been looking at the race and not just the next hurdle.
That's very interesting to hear. That is very interesting to hear, because as a recruitment business, of course, we work with quite a wide range of different. We work with cell and gene therapy businesses, work with smaller and larger biotech organizations. What I've started to see over certainly in the last year, we've had a few new roles that have been created which relate somehow to supply chain. And some of them have gone under different job titles, but they're not really roles that we've encountered before. So they're things like a patient supply manager, for example, or some have been called supply chain manager. But instead of looking for more traditional supply chain managers, what these companies seem to have been looking for are people who've come from the NHS and understand what it's like on the receiving end in whatever role they've been in. So maybe that's a slight way to perhaps address this, but it sounds like that's quite a big issue there, that maybe the developers are only focusing on the next stage. They're not necessarily looking at the bigger picture, and therefore don't fully appreciate what the knock-on effect of certain decisions they make now would be, however far down the line.
And you're absolutely right. I think the knock-on effect is you get into the situation where you're at the regulator or the payer who are needing to approve this, and they'll say, well, there's too many uncertainties. We're not sure whether this evidence tells us what we need to know, or it doesn't marry up with what the patients and the clinicians are telling us. And I know there's a huge amount of investment that goes on at that early stage, but I kind of feel like a little bit more needs to be thought about so that these things are captured along that development journey to make the end journey much better. And I often hear from industry, well, the NHS and NICE need to do better, to have better processes. They need to, adapt and change and understand that these are innovations. Therefore, if they're innovations, we have to accept. But of course, when you're working in the NHS and when you're working in an environment like that is dealing with humans, you don't want anything to go pear-shaped. You don't want patients to die. You don't want patients to have any adverse effects. So you've got to be as assured as possible to be able to make the right decision for the right reason and manage those resources that are very kind of small as effectively and efficiently as possible. So I think, kind of going back to your kind of question about this kind of new roles that are potentially being considered by some of the developers in this space, it's about understanding that end goal, being important in any field, but it's even more important in the development of these advanced therapies because they're innovative. So not only are we trying to solve the problems of these really rare diseases that aren't very well understood and well known, but we're also entering into a space that is also not well understood and not well known because it's a new therapy. Advanced therapies are things that we are still trying to get our head round. I was at a conference yesterday and we were having similar discussions about the challenges around manufacturing. And I was thinking, well, when we first introduced mobile phones in the world many, many years ago now, there was a lot of skepticism about whether we should use them or not. You'll get cancer and you might get,
I remember
there
that
was a
well.
lot of, because there were uncertainties about the technology. There were uncertainties about the long-term effects of using these devices. Now we all have them glued to our ear because somehow those uncertainties and those risks have been dissipated or been managed, or evidence and data has come through to suggest that actually those risks are reduced. And it's the same in this space. I think that people need to be comforted, but you can only comfort people with more evidence and more understanding and more uh, uh, ability to be able to kind of develop a strong case. So my experience is that manufacturers and developers need to do better around keeping that end goal in mind, and not just go to the next hurdle. If I were working with them, I'd suggest we break down that whole pathway, keeping the patient and the healthcare system in mind, because this would enable us to be able to understand the sorts of activities that need to be undertaken throughout the life cycle of that process, what's needed to secure that access and reimbursement. Because without that, what's the point of developing these products? They just sit on a shelf. If it's a fantastic product and it's going to change patients' lives, but you've not done the homework to be able to demonstrate the case, then it's no good to anyone.
Yeah,
So
of course.
in my kind of new role as a life sciences consultant, I can now have the ability to take people through these different hurdles, map that pathway, identify where these efficiencies can be made in their processes, and what evidence will be needed at each of those stages in order to keep jumping over those hurdles, as opposed to what we see now is more reactive approaches to then try and retrofit data or evidence into activities that have already been undertaken, and then the puzzle doesn't quite fit well together, and then you're constantly having to fight the system to give access.
Yes, of course. So earlier this year, you made that decision, didn't you, to move away from your employed work to become a consultant. I know from our previous conversations, there are a lot of different organisations that you are involved with. The Doddy Foundation, I understand you're a trustee there, and but now going off and doing your own consultancy work. I mean, how's that going so far?
It's going really, really well. I love the idea of being able to influence and support developers at the early stage, because a lot of this is about strategizing and being able to see that bigger picture and not just the kind of next process piece. I also accept, though, in this space, there's a lot of challenges around the kind of manufacturing and the regulation that's associated with that. And often these products get developed in small biotechs and then suddenly bought up by, the big pharma of the world. So information and data and evidence often gets lost between that kind of transaction that happens. But if you've got a good strategy and you've started to develop this thinking early on, then as a consultant, I can start to kind of build that package and help with that process in a way that others probably haven't thought about. And I was actually struck when I met your colleague at the Advanced Therapies Congress,
Alex,
that a lot of companies don't have those things in mind. So one of the things I think is really important is collaboration. People talk about it all the time, don't they? They say we need to collaborate with people, and it's a word that's used, but actually what it means for me is the first thing to do is collaborate with patients and patient groups, really understand what their needs are, and then what are the needs of the healthcare system associated with that. I heard at a meeting that I went to that the life science industry doesn't always listen or hear what the healthcare system priorities are and what patient priorities are. And that's really difficult because I've seen that when I've been in the NICE process, where a patient will say, this is the thing that really, really upsets me about my condition or my child's condition. I find this really difficult to deal with. And the company have not taken account of this being a real problem. And they're trying to fix something else for the patient, which is important, but may not be as valuable or as important to the patient or the family concerned. The manufacturing process, I feel, would benefit greatly from understanding that wider system and how it works and what it needs. But this can only be done if people are willing to work together and put their kind of ears and listening ears on, connecting with the patients, connecting with regulators and payers early in that product development life cycle through the various mechanisms that are available. So, for example, regulators and NICE and other payers in the European space also offer scientific advice. When you are developing these products, actually accessing that advice is really, really helpful because you can get a steer on the sorts of information that these people will need. And taking on that advice allows you to be much better prepared so that actually the value that you're demonstrating is captured. And it's not just then at the end, getting the patient groups out, lobbying and putting placards out and creating headlines. You don't have to because you've done the work really well. The other thing to really take into account, which I think I can help with in terms of connecting the patient groups, is really understanding how and what patients are willing to accept. So will they be comfortable with the side effects that might appear in a particular therapy, and what are they willing to kind of live with? Rare disease patients historically are quite risky. They're happy to take these risks because they don't have the treatments available. But would they be willing to take an injection? Are they willing to be infused for 4 hours? Is there a more invasive delivery technique that needs to be taken account of that has risks associated with it? So engaging with those people is going to be really important when you're developing these products. And then engaging with that kind of wealth, the healthcare system, can it accommodate the infrastructure that's needed to deliver the therapy? Just because you can develop it in a laboratory situation in a controlled environment doesn't mean that it's practically adaptable and implementable in an NHS setting. For example, having different vectors or viruses to deal with from a healthcare delivery point of view is a total nightmare. How can a hospital, for example, accommodate 10 different storage requirements for each of the products that they have to deliver to their patients? We know hospitals are already at creaking point, but imagine trying to find a room. Are they expected to have a warehouse of 50 fridges with all of these products? How can manufacturers be thinking about this and working together to make that process more efficient and more deliverable? What happens in the lab has to be then workable in the day-to-day running of a hospital or a healthcare provider. And what might seem like cool science in the laboratory can feel like a total nightmare for a clinician.
Well, yeah, it's really interesting to hear that. And you can imagine that someone comes up with an incredible concept, they develop it and think, okay, this is going to revolutionize the treatment of whatever this condition might be. But actually, how much do these people in that stage of development really understand what it's actually going to be like, however further down the line in the clinic? So it's really interesting hearing your take on that. And actually, we're hosting a discussion shortly, and with getting together some people who run different manufacturing organizations within the advanced therapy sector, and it'd be interesting to hear how much awareness they have of the end recipient, whether that's something that they're talking about. I mean, it sounds, from the way you're describing it, it sounds like that's something that, in your experience, hasn't really been talked about at that stage. So if someone was working with you, if someone was engaging with you, and let's just say that they are say a cell therapy business, for argument's sake, is maybe developing something and sort of taking it to GMP, at what stage would you say they would need to start sitting down and really thinking about further down the line, and at what point could someone with your expertise bring real value to that discussion?
If I had my way, I would like to work with companies very, very early on in their development stage. When they're in that kind of phase 1 science sort of stage, really starting to understand that there might be some possibility of this product becoming something life changing, or innovative. And I'm really now sort of really delighted that I've got the ability to be able to do that in this role as a life sciences consultant, because I really feel like that rare and complex disease space, what we can learn and what we can deliver in that space actually could then be translatable in the more prevalent and common conditions, because I kind of take it that the rare diseases have the most complex issues to resolve. And if you can really deal with them, then everything else should fall out of what you learn there.
Yeah, of course.
So I'm really open to working with organizations around helping them understand that whole pathway, providing that education and thinking about that race. Which hurdles do you need to be planning for, and how early do you need to be planning to jump those hurdles, so that actually the products, when they get to regulators and the payer side of things, they're having a much smoother, more efficient process getting through the process. But also thinking about supporting that development of that common thread through all of the activities, so that that's being pulled through right from the get-go, and people can really be understanding that we've got to keep that end goal in our mind. I've got a really good understanding of the UK landscape, as you can imagine, but I'm doing loads of work with the European landscape, and that's changing quite a lot from a regulatory and payer perspective, going into the kind of the EU HTA process. So really trying to understand how that's going to look, and then how do you then negotiate with the individual European member states around getting reimbursement.
Just if you don't mind me cutting in, I've actually got a question I'd like to ask about that. I was reading, there was the report that went out, it was only quite recently, and you contributed to it, the Takeda sponsored report, and it was really interesting to me. I mean, I'm by no means an expert, so it was interesting to get that sort of top level summary and read that from my perspective. It was comparing the UK, particularly England, with some other countries of France, Germany, and elsewhere around the world. So I just wondered, from your perspective, are there particular things that we can learn from other countries that are doing certain parts of this really well, that maybe we can actually take some of that and bring that into the UK, perhaps?
It's funny you should say that. And I probably have a little bit of a biased view, but I do think in some respects the UK is doing more innovative things in this space than other countries are. So,
Okay.
I think the only thing one of the things that come to mind that I think would be worth considering, that and the UK should think about, is joining forces with the devolved nations about undertaking these HTA evaluations. So obviously the European initiative is around doing joint clinical assessments now for new treatments that are coming through, and those assessments then get filtered down to the member states to then do their own kind of reimbursement negotiations with the company. Now, if we could get to do that rather than having an English system, which is nice, Scottish Medicines Consortium for Scotland, all Wales doing Wales, if we could even just as a nation bring ourselves together, I think that would, one, add huge value in terms of that process being done once. It would make massive efficiencies for the companies and for the HTA bodies, and also manage that inequitable access. So if Scotland says yes and England says no, people get upset, and if vice versa happens, it's so I think that would be the one thing. But I think otherwise, I think we have in the UK a fantastic foundation in which to build some of these things from. There's a lot of work going on in the life sciences vision, the rare disease framework. Some of the policies that we have in place are very well made and supportive of the life sciences industry. Although we do drive a hard bargain. I won't lie. We do drive a bit of a hard bargain, but
okay.
I think that is because of the system that we operate in.
A hard bargain in what kind of sense?
So industry will tell me, now that I'm working with them more closely, is that the UK or England pushes much more around the pricing of these things and expects much more from the companies associated with that. Now, there's a couple of things there. I think one of the things is we are working in a contained NHS that has a fixed budget that has to stretch it as far as it possibly can. So
Sure.
obviously they're going to want to get as much bang for their buck as they possibly can from that. We've also got the ability to undertake commercial negotiations, which, again, because they're being led by the NHS, they're going to be led quite rigorously. But I suppose this kind of brings me back to, if you got a better evidence base to present to the payers and the value was demonstrated, you'd get the opportunity to ask for the price for the value of the product. So it's kind of a kind of catch-22 in some respects. If you don't do the homework up front and you come with a case that's less developed, evidence isn't as clear and as robust as it could be, acknowledging that in some of these therapies and rare diseases, often we don't know and we won't ever know, and that's okay, because regulators and HTA bodies agree and understand that in some situations we may not know, we may never know, and they can deal with that. But when you come with cases that could have just been done that little bit better, then you argue, but we should be paying £1 million or £2 million per patient. Then it's really hard for the NHS and the system to feel comfortable that they're getting what they're paying for. And so this is where I think I can really support companies, really understanding, how do you build the best evidence package possible? How can you articulate the evidence that you're never going to be able to collect? And really reminding the system that there is a race for rare diseases. So sometimes we have to develop these products really quickly, get them to market quickly, because patients are dying or patients' diseases are progressing. And then I can support those companies through that process, through the reimbursement discussions, the commercial discussions, and really plan that early advice. So thinking about who to engage, when to engage, really some respects translating, because sometimes the language that the healthcare system deploys is often quite complicated for the industry to understand, and they're not often speaking the same language, or they're just using different terminology to say the same thing. And then thinking about supporting that interpretation between the interdependency between pricing, reimbursement, and the HST the HTA approach. So I think it's about trying to think about that early, mapping those things. And then the other thing that I'm really wanting to support companies with is coaching members on how to approach these organizations. What sort of questions should you ask? Who the people should you have in the room? Who should you engage with early? How do you engage with them? What are the sort of things that they're going to be wanting to hear from you, and how do you present them? Not, this is a great product, just buy it. It doesn't wash. And I think industry need to be educated and supported through that process, because they don't know. It's a difficult environment to enter.
Yeah, well, I imagine your insights then would be hugely valuable. So I certainly wish you lots of success, lots of
Thank
ongoing
you.
success in continuing to build your consultancy.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Sheila, I mean, I've learned loads from listening to you talking today. And what we'll also do, I'm going to go back and read over that report again that came out a few days ago. But also, what we'll do when we share this podcast is we'll share lots of different links of things that you're connected to, so people can do some further reading about you as an individual, your consultancy and what it does, and just the broader topics that you've been discussing today.
Brilliant.
So thank you. I'm so grateful to you for coming onto the podcast today.
No, thanks for asking me. I feel privileged that I was able to share some of my insights, and actually, it's given me loads of food for thought. Just talking through this is like, oh, I could, I was thinking maybe I should write a little blog about this myself.
Well, maybe so. I mean, yeah, since we launched the podcast, the amount of comments that we've had from people who are involved in the industry in one way or another, and it's just, if we can bring people on who can share their innovative ideas, and they can share sort of bite-sized chunks of things that they can bring, and then hopefully if we can help join the dots a little bit, using a phrase you used earlier yourself, then it just, if it can just help to continue those innovations in life sciences, then we're all playing our part.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I still firmly believe the UK is the best fertile landscape for doing that. I think we've got a lot going for us, and we need to find a way of keep reminding ourselves that yes, it's okay. Things will work themselves out, and the government are very supportive. Through the life sciences vision and all of those things. But I just think if I could find a way of educating some of the other players in the system, then that joining the dots would become a much more fluent exercise, and people would be more comfortable thinking about these things.
Brilliant. Well, Sheila, thank you again so much for your time. It's
No,
very much
thank you,
appreciated.
Steve. Have a great weekend, and I hope your kitchen arrives.